Tell me a little bit about the time when you came here to MCV and how things went over the next few years, particularly under the leadership of Dr. Hume.
Well, actually, I was recruited by Dr. Hume, although Dr. Kendall Nelson, who was the dean then, also felt like he was involved in the recruitment. And prior to that time, I planned on staying my whole career in New York. I was at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I was being groomed to be director there by the current director. But when he got fired himself, it became clear that maybe my future there wasn't so secure. And it just happened about that time that David Hume asked me to replace Egdahl, who was his vice chairman, who, to Dave's disappointment, was named chairman of Boston University Department of Surgery, and he now needed a vice chairman. And the reason David Hume needed a vice chairman was that he was so busy with the transplant program, so busy running around the country talking about it and stimulating the early days of transplant, that he needed somebody home to mind the store. Or as Dr. Kendall Nelson, the dean, said, they needed somebody to answer the phone in the Department of Surgery. So I was recruited by him. I think he was attracted to me because I had done all the early kidney transplants in New York City, even though I worked at a cancer hospital, since we had the only dialysis unit in New York at the time. This is in the early 60s. And since I worked with the laboratory doing research that was doing the kidney transplant and did the kidney dialysis, they asked me to try a transplant or two, that since they wouldn't accept some of the patients down here, they had such a load. So I got involved in the early days in the national meetings of the working group of, although I didn't do very many compared to here, and Dave sort of got to know me there. And then he saw I'd done some research on graft versus host with Morton Simonson in England. So that sort of impressed him I might be a scientist, which was sort of misleading because I wasn't too scientific. And so he recruited me. And when I went to his office, I saw this funny little diploma, which was such a chintzy little thing from Chicago, which is just what I had. And then I remembered him, because when I was in college, the first year in college, I played intramural football against him when he was on the medical school team. And I remember, I thought, that's that obnoxious guy who talked so big. He talked like Trump did a little bit. And I thought, I didn't like him then, but I certainly liked him now, because he was so enthusiastic about the program. And I thought, well, I'll bargain with Dr. Hume. My career now is mainly cancer surgery. I was on the staff at Memorial Sloan Kettering, being a fellow, and then being on the staff for 10 years at Memorial. I actually ran one of the services at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And so I said, well, I'll bargain. If I can be vice chairman, it'll work out if I can have a separate division, independent division for cancer surgery. We'll call it surgical oncology. And of course, David Hume was interested mainly in transplant. He was mainly interested in having somebody to run the department for him for the mundane things. Oh, whatever you want, he said. So that's how we got to surgical oncology. And then I thought, I bet if I'm going to start something, I got to have a partner. So I brought my fellow down here, also as a faculty member when I came. So I had the feeling at least take two of us to survive to run a division.
So who was your fellow at that time?
Jose Terz was his name.
Okay.
He stayed here on the faculty until 1980 when he went out to the City of Hope to be chief of surgery out there.
Okay.
But he was a very loyal fellow in the lab. Had been well trained in Argentina before he came, and was really a great guy. He was big on the head and neck cancer part, which was part of our surgical oncology division then. And we only had 2 full-timers, but then again, anybody who had a cancer case had to admit it to our service and be on our program so that they could enter our clinical research activity. Because we also, in addition to clinical cancer, we had a laboratory program, and I had 2 full-time PhD faculty members in my division at the time.
How many faculty were there in the Department of Surgery when you came in?
I don't know the total number, but it was much smaller than you have it now. Very much smaller. B.W. Haynes had about two faculty members in his burn and trauma service. The Red service, which was Dr. Hume's service, was mainly Dr. Hume and Dr. H.M. Lee, although Dickie Newsom, who was one of our residents, when he finished, he went on that service. Cardiac was Louis Bosher and Richard Lauer, who hardly talked to each other, and Jim Brooks. So there were only 3 in that division. And I can't remember all the details, but you can see each division was relatively small. Arnold Salzberg in pediatric surgery was the only one, so I helped him out part-time in pediatrics for the pediatric cancer work. And it was sort of a small, folksy group compared to what you have now.
But neurosurgery and orthopedics?
Neurosurgery, orthopedics, urology were all divisions within our department, and that's why I fashioned the surgical oncology to be similar to those divisions, which, although they were under the Department of Surgery and Dr. Hume, also had the privilege of dealing directly with the dean. It was sort of the administrative route, and so my division was the first one to do that. So then Dr. Haynes, since we had a division, they decided if we're going to have a division of surgical oncology, we'll have burns and trauma, and we'll have the Red service, which was vascular and endocrine. So there were 3 general surgical divisions, and the VA, of course. Yale Zimberg was the chief at the VA. He's a leading surgeon who then eventually went to town, but did a wonderful job out at the VA. And so, but it was a much smaller department.
So what was Hume like to work with for you?
Well, Hume was always full of enthusiasm and vigor. The house staff worshipped him. Nothing was more important to him than the house staff. So he met every week with the house staff, and when they had chief's rounds, in which they would try to trick him. And he always said, I don't understand why you and Salzberg and Haynes don't want to take that over, but they loved it so much because he made it fun. I have to admit, sometimes he made up information. He and I had arguments at our DNC all the time, because if he wanted to win the argument, he quoted some reference that often didn't exist. But and we had fun tricking him too, but then he'd take me aside and say, Waller, now, these conferences aren't to make fun of people. And I said, yeah, right. But he was a lot of fun to work with because he was so enthusiastic. I think he neglected his family some because his life was the hospital. I had a 2-year-old I did a Whipple on once, and I had portal vein involvement, and I thought I better get a real vascular surgeon to help with this complex vascular thing, and he did. And then post-op, the patient wasn't doing too well a few days later, and I called him and asked him for his advice. He came in and stayed all night with me. I mean, he just was a tiger when it came to being a clinical surgeon, and it was his life. And every time something new came, like the first woman transplant who became pregnant, he'd always yell, another first, another first. He liked having a lot of things to be first.
So when you came here, you started the surgical oncology division.
Yeah.
Was in any other academic institution in the United States, was surgical oncology a separate subspecialty, or was it something?
No, actually, I think the term surgical oncology was probably used in Europe. Nobody ever used the term here. And the only place where there was specialization on cancer surgery were the cancer centers, which were always considered a little second-rate academically. Memorial, MD Anderson was started at about the 1950, when I was a fellow, actually. Roswell Park was started in 1913, Memorial about the same time. And so most of the places where they did what we would now call surgical oncology were all cancer hospitals. And it occurred to me while I was there that I liked the academic idea, but I liked focusing on cancer. And I hated to call it a division of cancer surgery. It didn't sound right. So I thought, well, I invented the surgical oncology thing. So we had the first surgical oncology division in the country. And then about 10 years later, I did a survey of all the medical schools, along with a couple of colleagues, and it turned out that about 60 or 70% had surgical oncology divisions or services by that time. And of course now they're subdividing surgical oncology, which I found a little disappointing because I liked the variety. And when we started, we had head and neck surgery as well as abdominal surgery and soft tissue sarcomas and all those things as part of the specialty. And now I would say endocrine has been more or less added frequently to surgical oncology nationally.
Right.
And head and neck is really almost entirely ENT.
Right. Right. So it's definitely evolved. But the surgical oncology boards are relatively new.
Yeah, I was on the American Board of Surgery. I was put on the American Board of Surgery in 1973, and then we were all against vascular surgery being separated out as a specialty, and gradually got used to the fact that it was a good idea. Most of us involved in the early surgical oncology area felt we were general surgeons. We just had a hobby in the surgical treatment of cancer, and we hated the established boards and things of that sort because it seemed like it was only a way for the surgeon who had a little training to crowd out his fellow general surgeon in the community. And so most of us on the board for years were against that. I still wrote an editorial about 4 years ago on why I still was against it, even though it's now come to pass. I don't see a lot of point in it still myself. I think that to be a good surgical oncologist, you have to be a good general surgeon.
So in terms of when you came here, there was no cancer center at that time. So was that a medical oncology branch that existed to partner with you?
There was a lady who had to go to sanatorium halfway through her training for tuberculosis in the 40s. Her name was Susan Millette. She was married to a preacher who was head of the National Conference of Christians and Jews. And he put her through medical school, and after he'd gotten his ministerial training, she came here and was a cancer doctor. Early days of chemotherapy, of course, were only nitrogen mustard and 5-fluorouracil, but she was a cancer doctor who really gave a lot of care and support to cancer patients. She was the one lady cancer program. And when I came, the dean sort of thought, their cancer centers are beginning to form here in the country, a little more around universities. We ought to get one. And the reason she was passed by was that he didn't believe women doctors amounted to much. Now, the dean was not a bad guy, but he didn't think women doctors amount to much. So when I came here to start surgical oncology, she had a chip on her shoulder that I was her competition. But we soon became close friends, And so, and the dean said, really, I want to get a cancer center going. And they had, E. Richard King was head of radiology, and he had come from the Navy, but he'd been a pioneer in nuclear medicine. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of good basic science researchers, that some of whom I was collaborating with. We had Susan. The head of medicine also felt the same way about women, so he hired a man's medical oncologist from Roswell Park, and the dean said, we got to have a cancer center. So I was more interested in the surgical oncology division, but I said, okay. So I was given the chairman job of getting that going, and we had a planning grant, and we really got going pretty well, so we thought we better apply for a cancer center and find us somebody good to be a director. And I was on that committee. Every time we interviewed a possible director, they all seemed to be wanting to build an empire, mm-hmm. whereas we had thought of the cancer center as being an integration of the basic science departments and the clinical departments in a cooperative venture. Mm-hmm. And then finally the vice president, Lauren Wood, said, Walter, you got to be director of this thing. And I thought, I don't want to give up surgery. I'm a general surgeon who does surgical oncology. And my biochemical friend, Bill Banks, who was my research collaborator, I said, well, I will agree to be director. This is about 1973. I'll agree to be director if Bill Banks can be my deputy or co-director who can answer questions when I want to be a surgeon. And so Lauren Wood said, anything you say. So we started with, we called him co-director. And every morning I'd go by his lab and we'd collaborate, and then I'd go to do my thing as a general surgeon doing surgical oncology and teaching and so forth. And it worked out pretty well. We ended up, Mr. Massey was our first big donor. And so when we got him interested because he had family members who'd had cancer, we really decided we could go ahead. And we called the cancer center the MCV VCU Cancer Center because the Board of Visitors over at the other campus decided nobody can have their name on that cancer center unless they give this huge gift of $2 million. Oh my goodness. And so our goal was $2 million, and we were formed as a cancer center and put in our grant in 1973, became, I think in 1974, became funded, but we didn't name it the Massey Cancer Center until they entered up the $2 million from the, and of course nowadays, the fundraising for Massey Cancer Center have been multi-million compared to that, but the Board of Visitors felt like $2 million was about all this town could tolerate at that time.
So after Hume, what happened to the Department of Surgery?
Well, we had a small department, and I assumed as vice chairman I was in charge. And then I was surprised the next day, the dean calling me and asking me if I would be vice chairman, would be a deputy or interim chairman. I said, oh my God, I always thought it was. So for 2 years I served as interim chairman until we recruited Laser Greenfield in 1974 to come as chairman. I think he came in September, which is when the time I was to become director of the cancer center. And Laser Greenfield was here about 10 years, and he did a marvelous job. But when we changed deans, he wasn't giving support to surgery as much, the new one, and he didn't recognize Laser's wonderful talents. So the University of Michigan finally convinced him to move there, although he didn't want to move for quite a while. He was my partner in tennis once a week, and we were great friends, and he loved it here, but he finally moved to Michigan after that.
I just spoke to him recently. He now lives in Phoenix, near Phoenix.
Although I think at part of the year he still goes back up to Michigan, but they live down in Arizona. Yeah.
So what happened during Greenfield's time? Did the department grow? Did the divisions
Well,
expand? Or?
In contrast to Hume, Hume wanted his residents to go into the laboratory, and I enjoyed that idea of academic surgeon doing so. But research was fine just so that it was in transplant. Mm-hmm. And so actually, when I came, was the first time we had any research outside of transplantation. Mm-hmm. And I started some cancer immunology and so forth. When laser came, several things were different with David. First of all, as Salzburg pointed out, he put us to sleep in the conferences compared to Hume, because Hume was always argumentative and dynamic, and Laser was sort of quiet and subdued. And I'd been used to running the DNC, and we'd been having a lot of fun, and it sort of got sort of diluted. But then it became clear that Laser had a much broader view of general surgery than David, even though he wasn't as research oriented as David was. And he really developed a much more balanced department so far as research programs and other things. And he mentored his younger faculty much better. Some of our faculty we had when I was here with Hume failed because they needed some fatherly mentoring, and Hume didn't go for that much. He appointed you and you're on your own, sort of. And so I think in many ways Laser did a better job as leader and chairman than David, but he never established quite the excitement in terms of the surgical forefront as right. Hume did, because of Hume's dynamic approach to transplant.
Laser was a thoracic surgeon by training. And
he was a thoracic and vascular surgeon at Oklahoma. But when he got here, the problem, we had Dick Lauer, a young, dynamic right. cardiac surgeon who'd been with Shumway in California, and it was sort of clear to Laser that one, if he was going to be chairman, he couldn't really focus on being a full-time cardiac surgeon, and secondly, he couldn't compete. Lauer was about ready to retire at a young age, almost. And I think they sort of decided he wouldn't interfere with Lauer, and Laser moved more into being a vascular surgery specialist rather than a cardiac one, although his background was both.
And then when Laser left, he moved to Michigan. Who then took on as? There was a search at that time.
Yeah, they had a search for a while, and then the dean was thrilled. We got this cardiac surgeon from Duke.
Okay, so that's an Andy Wexler.
Andy Wexler, and Andy Wexler was advertised as the hot item, and Andy was a very nice person, and I found him very nice to work with, but he was clearly totally focused on cardiac surgery and was reading his mail and his cell phone during conferences and things instead of being an active leader like Laser. And the contrast with Laser Greenfield was quite clear. Then he got recruited to Philadelphia and left sort of abruptly for that. And that's, I think, when Dr. Newsom was interim chairman.
Right. And then Harvey, I think Harvey was the chair, Harvey Sugarman.
Oh, I see. Yeah, maybe Harvey, Dickey was
a dean.
Dickey was interim chairman between Greenfield and Wexler.
Right.
And then after Wexler, Harvey was interim chairman, and then at that point there was a fairly long time of discussion. Dickey was dean.
Right.
They actually brought Laser Greenfield back in as a consultant at that time. And all of us were advising Dickie. He'd been our resident. When the dean's been your resident, you advise him some, even if they don't take your advice. So, and then I think Jim Neifeld became chairman.
Ron
Wexler.
Merrill came.
Yeah. I mean Ron
Merrill.
yeah.
Briefly.
Ron Merrill was at Yale.
Right.
And he was at odds with the dean at Yale at the time. And he had a lot of appeal because of his telemedicine and some of his very dynamic research ideas. I was on the search committee. We thought he was pretty exciting after we'd looked at a lot of different chairmen, including the one who's now chairman at Charlottesville. But we were thrilled to have him, and he got going. But after a while, he didn't get along too well with the vice president. So that's the way things go.
Right. So if you look at your career, what do you think have been your major accomplishments?
They always say something about administration is negative, but I think the thing that I found most satisfying to me, besides having a chance to do both research and clinical medicine in an era when it was much easier to do it, I think my biggest accomplishment probably was getting surgical oncology going in this nation. Because I really do think nobody thought up this obvious idea of having a hobby within general surgery that focused on interdisciplinary work with other disciplines in cancer therapy. Probably because we didn't have other good disciplines in my early years. Both radiation oncology and hematology oncology have really expanded their capabilities so much over the same period of time, so it was a ripe time to start surgical oncology. And I think if I left anything behind worthwhile, it's probably getting that idea of having surgical oncology within general surgery up and going. Now, I've gotten a fair amount of attention and credit for the Cancer Center, but actually I don't deserve a lot for that, because I was just sort of chairman of a bunch of other disciplines who were all working together to get that thing going. And then when it all came to pass, I seemed to get more credit than I deserved. But I'm very satisfied that Massey Cancer Center is maintaining itself as a very successful unit since we started. It was funded the entire time I was director, which is about 14 years, and right now they're doing much better in every way than I did, and they're continuing to do well.
Right.
Oh, another guy that did the same thing. Sheldon Horsley interviewed me for Richmond Academy years ago, but I don't think they ever. It was audio, and I think they lost it. So.
So fun.
Yeah. But I'll make up more information if necessary.
Were you ever involved in the first heart transplant the whole time with Hume and Lauer?
Yeah, oh yeah.
You were involved?
Well, we were a small family then.
Right.
And Hume was always trying to get Lauer to do a transplant, and he was always waiting for the ideal circumstance, and then Bernard, who practiced in our lab, went over and did one. So then shortly after that, we had one. It was on the 7th floor of West Hospital, and Hume assisted Lauer, and I was on the telephone answering questions from the newspaper. So my role was sort of, as vice chairman, then was sort of contact with the news. And then Wilder, Wilder.
Sued.
Yeah, well, Wilder chased down the guy who died, who was the judge had decided was unclaimed and we could use his heart, and he had woolly hair and all that then. and he established a lawsuit.
Right.
So when they had the trial, Hume just sort of, he loved it. He thought it was more fun, and Lauer kept saying they're suing us for murder, and I took over Hume's practice for a whole month then, because he was down there just enjoying himself at the trial. He was just,
So there's no-
because they did establish
The brain death.
the brain death thing then, and he was just so thrilled, and he kept saying another first, and Lauer kept looking at Drew. He said, "Yeah, you sued us for murder." It was funny.
So the judge, the lawyer who represented Lauer, was he just recently passed away.
I think I remember, because I treated his wife, and he was our malpractice lawyer, who later, after he retired from this group, was no longer a defense lawyer.
Right.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember his name. He's a really neat guy, because he
Very
used to
nice
ask me questions about
Yeah. So
cases in town.
he had all the original records
Oh, really?
from the case, and he and I had dinner one night and we were looking through all, because that. So my interest in the whole thing was a lot was written about the transplant side of things, but nothing was really written about the donor side of the operation. So he had all the data on the donor and what.
Yeah, he was an unclaimed guy. Nobody.
But there were people, because in those days, with all the segregation and all that, I think
Yeah.
people are afraid. So the police go knock on the donor's family in the Churchill district at middle of the night, I think, and nobody would come and accept anything because they were afraid. So, but later apparently they came out, and so he had all the details. But he, unfortunately, right after we had dinner and we talked, he passed away. So, and I'm trying to get in touch with the family to see if he had actually transcripts of the law case and everything.
Yeah, I
So-
remember him. He was a neat guy. He used to come to see me about cases in town, whether they should sue or not,
Right.
because his wife was a patient of mine.
So unfortunately, and I've tried to reach Doug Wilder. I've contacted him a number of times, but he's never replied.
Well, of course, I don't think he's proud of his role.
No, but it's an important. Somebody's got to defend.
He was an ambulance chaser
Right, but it's
who later became governor.
right, but it's a story that has to be told in some form or fashion.
Yeah. Now, the person who might know more about it, though, is Jody. Have you talked to Jody Costi?
I haven't talked to Jody.
Well, Jody Costi's been here forever. And she's sort of been the supervisor of the history of medicine thing over at the library.
Okay, I'll talk to her.
And she's just nice and straightforward as everything. And I noticed when I did get interviewed by Sheldon, she sat in on it.
Okay.
And then when Chip wanted to interview me about Hume's he arranged it with her, and she actually did the interview while he took notes.
Okay.
So I get the feeling that she's basically real interested in history. So
Yeah, she is. She's the historian.
and she may know a lot about that trial.
So
too.
I'll find out.
Yeah.
I'll ask her. So it's something that he and I were going to write this up as an article for the transplant journals, because but then it never. We just didn't do it. I probably have to do it. So.
Yeah, I used to publish in the I actually published I think there was a squib when we had the first transplant that went off immunosuppression. And it was because we've been using 6-MP instead of Imuran, because we were more familiar with 6-MP in a cancer hospital.
Right.
And we overtreated one of our early transplants. And so we just stopped it and just had him, well, he was still on steroids, but that was one of the first ones. And he was also an ABO mismatch.
Mm. Was it a kidney or a liver?
Yeah, kidney. Oh no, we didn't do livers at all then. As a matter of
Just
fact,
kidneys.
Hume, when I came here, Hume wanted me, surgical oncology is okay, but I want you to do the liver transplants. And of course, because I'd done a lot of liver surgery, but frankly, the idea of doing liver transplants left me cold, and it never got started here until a few years later. And I'm sure it was sure tough at first. Anyhow. I'm gonna go solve
Yeah.
my other problem.
Let's go do that.
Check in to see what they decided on my wife and then plumbing. Hey,
Good
thank
luck.
you for
Thank
putting
you.